and welcome to Conversations on Leadership, a podcast by Academy Wales. Our guest for this episode is Martin Downs, Lead Consultant for Learning and Development at Cwmpas. Martin, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Matt.
Now, before we get started, I'm sure our listeners would be really interested to hear just a little bit more about yourself, your background, and your current role.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Let me do that reverse order because we're up to date there, right? So, I've been at Cwmpas for over 6 years. My role, as you mentioned, it's not a very exciting title, isn't it? Learning and Development Lead Consultant. What it actually means in practice is that I get to work with public sector organisations and private sector and third sector on leadership programs, co-design events, workshops. So yeah, very, very privileged to work in the role that I've got. Cwmpas as an organisation, we've been going for 43 years. We're the UK's largest cooperative development agency, and we were, I'm sure lots of people listening will know, we were Wales Cooperative Centre for over 40 years of that time. So yeah, love working in that sector. My longer term background, I've run a business. I ran a startup creative agency. Worked in the private sector, and then before that, after graduating, I spent a long time within the third sector and was a senior manager for a kind of UK-wide charity. So yeah, something of a flavour, I think, of the kind of work stuff.
Wow, that's varied.
Eclectic, I like to call it.
Eclectic, yeah, okay, that's a nice word. Yeah, I like that, and I think that will be shown when we come into the main body of the podcast later on. But before we do that, one thing we like to do is just a few quick fire questions.
All right, sounds good.
What is your favourite noise?
I guess one of them is the sound of birdsong. I'm particularly, not just in the summer, particularly when winter ends and spring starts. Yeah, there's just something wonderful about it.
And conversely to that, what would be your least favourite noise?
I don't know. Maybe the sound of a final whistle and another Welsh defeat in the rugby. Maybe that's it.
Oh, that hurts. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Oh, a friend of mine says I've got a lost vocation. He said you should have been an English professor. Okay. So maybe that's it. If it was, if it's not that, sometimes you discover skills later on that for years, you thought I can't go there. It would probably be a chef.
Oh wow, okay, that's quite a difference.
It is, yeah, and that's only in the last few years. I've learned to love cooking, whereas before it was very functional and didn't have the confidence. So yeah, so either an English professor or a chef.
And what profession would you least like to attempt?
I'm colourblind, so I don't know. I would be electrician. I probably would be, not very safe. I'm just, I really, really admire people who are artisans, very skilled with their hands, and I'm just not. So it's not that I wouldn't like to do it. I suppose part of me would love to, but anything with those practical skills, yeah, that's not me.
And lastly, in this, what would you say is your greatest strength?
I love public speaking, and I've come to for somebody who's actually naturally quite an introvert, I've come to love it and embrace it. So that's the strength.
So thank you for those. I know our listeners do enjoy just getting to know the person behind the voice a little bit more. What does effective leadership look like in today's complex and social public service landscape? And how can leaders adapt to that rapid change?
That is a great question. It's just the rapid pace of change is in itself, it's destabilizing. This, I think one of the things that anybody who's involved in leadership with any level is the amount that you have to learn, the amount of the just thinking in terms of digital technology and the significant rapid changes and being able to get a handle on all of those things is significant. Let's face it, largely impossible to do, so the notion of the kind of effective leadership being some sort of solo thing, I guess it flattens the hierarchies. I think we're just conscious there's so little that we know, which in itself is an encouraging thing. Effective leadership becoming more distributed and collaborative and so on. There's probably 2 or 3 other things I want to say on this in terms of effective leadership. So I think the first thing is, well, what are the things that are still fixed and we're not going to move? So have you ever had that experience of being at a train station and there are two trains side by side and you get on board and then you're not sure is your train moving or the other train moving?
Yes.
It's like, well, take a look at the platform because the platform's not going to move. And rapidly changing times, there is, what doesn't move or what ought not to be moving. Okay, so piece of advice I was given on this, I found really helpful, was every few months make sure you check in with your values. But that's personal, whether it's checking in with the sort of those Nolan principles of public life. But I think we can't have effective leadership unless if we drift. So checking in with values being important. I'll come to this, again, I've really benefited from the kind of work of Keith Grint on thinking about leadership. So whether we're dealing with crisis or whether there's a standard operating procedure, so we know what to do, we just need to do it better. Or if we're dealing with wicked problems and complexity and we don't know, and then we need to be asking questions, and we need a much wider circle of people coming together to find ways forward. And I guess also, really have appreciated the work of Dave Snowden and Cynefin Framework and estuarine mapping, his, that work he's been doing recently. I think for effective leadership, I think probably both of those sources will be really important.
I think there's some really interesting points in there. I do like the idea of keeping those fixed points. That does really speak to me. I like that. Now, I was about to move on to your Start Something Good tool.
Yeah.
But it suddenly just occurred to me as we're speaking, there's probably quite a few people listening who maybe haven't come across it. So before we do, maybe you'd like to take a little bit of time just to explain what the tool is?
During my time at Cwmpas, when I first joined, the challenge was how do we engage more people with social enterprise? And I take the view that if you want to understand social enterprise or social entrepreneurship or social innovation better, you can't do it in cold blood. So you can't just kind of transmit chunks of information about understanding it. That people need to have skin in the game. So that's what got me thinking, and a very serendipitous conversation with an academic at Cardiff Business School, Dr. Anthony Samuel, and he wanted me to come run a workshop with the students, and he said to me, when you run a hackathon instead. So I went away, I had a good think about what that might look like, and taking this sort of hackathon, working in teams over an intense period, developing ideas, then pitching them, which is often set within a competition framework. So I thought, well, yeah, we'll do that with the students, but can we do that in a community setting? And I was working with Town Square up in Wrexham and said, well, why don't we do a day together on this? So we start with social challenges and we use this hackathon approach, and then people pitch ideas. And initially we called it the hack of kindness, which came to me on the train when I was on my way up. It's a bit of a Marmite phrase. So that is what has now become Start Something Good. So in essence, Start Something Good, our main work at Cwmpas with it is around collaborative co-design events. So people from diverse backgrounds, public, private, residents, voluntary organizations, all coming together with a shared challenge. Everybody's got skin in the game, and beginning to nurture and develop some fresh ideas to address that challenge, and then pitching those ideas and doing that in the open, where there's therefore then a shared ownership of trying to find some new ways forward. So that's the heart of what that Start Something Good approach is about.
And you mentioned there about how it brings together these kind of diverse sectors. What have you learned from that about fostering collaboration across those diverse sectors?
Thanks for asking that. I think on the public sector side, I can give you some really kind of good examples where public bodies have wanted to try this as a different way of working. And I appreciate for them there's an element of risk in doing that. So where, it's not a public meeting where you're in broadcast mode and you're telling people what's happening. It's very much an invitation to sit around a table with as diverse a group of people who've never worked together before to find some fresh ways forward. So I do think there's a lot of risk, and I do admire the organizations that, I mean, some have experienced an event and come to us and said, well, can you run something like this for us? And then others, they've not experienced it directly, and they're just like, can you go for it and run it? So that trust on that side is important. But I think one of the big lessons is the whole way of working is authentic collaboration. So we are deliberately trying to flatten hierarchies. We say to people, good ideas can come from anywhere. That we don't have a competition model, because originally these things were competition based.
Yeah.
So I only did one. There was a competition, and I realized it was a mistake as I was introducing the event, which is, it's not the time you want to get their insight. Yeah. And I thought, yeah, people care about the community. They want to see good things happening. It's not about finding the one best idea. It's about finding as many good small ideas. We often talk about them as sketches of ideas that can then be developed. So I think what we've found, people have said this to me, they've kind of looked around a room at these events and said just how amazing it is that people are working together in a different way than they ever have before. And that means a lot. And changing the way that we work together, I think that's one of the big lessons. This is one of the key things about it. So it's often it's a catalyst for new ideas. It's the start of a journey. And which is why some of the events that we've run, the next tangible step has been like a new working group forming that brings public, private, community much closer together.
And if you think about the work that has been done across, all these various different sectors, which projects would you say have taught you the most about creating sustainable social impact?
That's a good question, because it's a subject agnostic model. So if you need to bring together the cross sectors to work together, again, people have come to us and said, well, would it work for climate action? Would it work for town centre regeneration? Does it work for food sustainability? And invariably it does. Mm-hmm. In terms of creating long-term social impact, I guess that I don't want to over-exaggerate what's possible, because it's called starting good for a reason, because it's the beginning of that process. And and starting small with what we're doing and starting those different ways of working, where can those things lead and what can be the long term? In terms of the impact, look, we have seen people kind of form new social enterprises. We've seen new projects start. We've seen people access, I think, probably about 800,000 in funding. I guess the other thing to say is that social impact, it's all in the context of the funding cycles that we operate in, and the uncertainties around that, and that makes any form of social change and impact really difficult. I think one local authority leader said to me, we haven't had the same year since 2020. When you've got all this kind of shifts, it's difficult, because sometimes then it's short term and then there's a gap. And I think what we're missing, and I would love to see, is these events catalyzing, but a longer form of meaningful cross-sector collaboration, and not by proxy either, but actually genuinely communities, public services, businesses working together, and creating that longer term change.
With programs like Social Leaders Cymru, what skills and mindsets do you believe will define the next generation of leaders in Wales?
This is one of our big projects at Cwmpas. So Social Leaders Cymru is a partnership. So it's a leadership development program for the third sector. It's been between ourselves at Cwmpas, Clore Social Leadership, and WCVA, Wales Council for Voluntary Action. And we've been working together on this since 2021, and it's been funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. We're in our third year of delivery. We've had 122 leaders supported, place-based, Wrexham, Newport, and Swansea, as well as some online programs. And we've got programs coming up West Wales and in Rhyl. And actually, public sector has been really supportive in helping us kind of get the word out to develop all this. So yeah, so very much kind of live piece of work going on. A part of it is that we're developing a leadership declaration. So we have had workshops with 145 leaders, majority from the voluntary sector or third sector or social economy, but also from public sector as well, in thinking through, well, what's needed, what do we need in terms of future leadership. So part of my answer, because it's their answer, is to say people want cross-sector collaboration. They want to have networks where they can, be working together. Question of, leadership has context. Sometimes that context is organization, but there's a context of we have shared social challenges that we're trying to address, and how do we do that? So I think what's down the road and what's needed. I think we've been very fortunate to have the support to deliver these programs. We're seeing it makes a real difference. We're seeing that peer learning experience is crucial, and it does foster good collaboration, and we need more of that. But in order for that to happen, we need to create the spaces where it can happen.
Yeah.
So that people will often complain about being siloed, but the silos are caused by sectors not being close enough together, and also the mechanisms by which sectors are funded. So I think, in terms of what leadership is needed and what we hope to see, yes, we want to see people's capabilities developed. We want to see those leadership skills developed. But I think we need to create the spaces in where that can both happen with peers and also where that can be done collaboratively. And I think leadership is this is Keith Grint again, essentially contested concept. So I think understanding something of the context in which leadership is exercised will help us know what we need to do to develop people. And I guess there's a learning dimension to this, which is important. So, what opportunities are we creating? Whether it's yourselves, Academy Wales, whether it's another organisation providing leadership, whether it happens locally or more broadly, are we developing that curiosity? Are we developing that active engagement? I would like to see more of that. I would like to see more of those opportunities and more of that bringing people together, shared societal challenges, tapping into all of the knowledge and wisdom that we've got.
One last thing
yes.
I'd like to do. So a little section we have at the end is to kind of flip the roles, if you like, and ask you to pose a question for our next guest. But before we do that, a question from our previous guest, Neil Malarkey, which I think fits quite nicely with what we've talked about. So we've talked a lot about collaboration and engagement amongst sectors and different areas, but Neil actually asked how you can effectively create a collaborative culture within your team.
Neil has asked a very good question. We all have different motivations being within organizations, wherever we are, whichever sector. I think increasingly that sense of shared purpose and shared mission and the why we're doing what we're doing, that I think is probably one of the most vital things to get hold of. You've got something to work with then, because that's where the energy lies. We have a sense that we are we're on a mission together. We want to see things change. We want to see something better. I think the second thing that's needed is that sense of, well, we haven't got all the answers, and we need to try things. They're not always going to work. And that's not easy, particularly if you're a custodian of public money. But having that capacity to try and test and learn and fail, that involves risk. But actually, as a mentality and as a culture of doing things, that's going to be really important. So holding together purpose and holding together a culture that says, okay, experiment, try, learn, that's key. For all our Start Something Good hackathon events or community ideas events, we show people the innovation engine, which is developed by Tina Seelig at Stanford. That's a Mobius strip, and there are 3 central aspects, and then three around the outside. And the internal ones are we need knowledge, imagination, and attitude, and the externals are culture, habitat, and resources. And that collaborative culture of developing new things together, you need all 6 together. So I think those, paying attention to all those things, if we want greater collaboration, we need that shared purpose. We need that willingness to learn and honesty around it. But we need the support to be able to try and test things and do them.
So lastly, what would you like to ask to our future guest?
One of the great questions that we pose from time to time is, what's the best piece of advice you've ever had about leadership?
Well, I really look forward to hearing the answer from whoever that next guest is. So thank you so much for your time. I feel we have covered a huge amount of areas and topics. I have found this incredibly fascinating. I think our listeners will too, and I hope you've enjoyed the experience. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely loved it, and it gives me an opportunity to reflect and talk about, as what you said earlier, is all of that learning and feeding that in, and having done 70 odd plus Start Something Good of events, still learning on the job with all of it.
Mae un podlediad sgwrsiau ar arweinyddiaeth ar gael trwy ein gwefan. Mae'r hawlfraint y podlediad yma yn cael ei gadw gan Llywodraeth Cymru. Our Conversations on Leadership podcast is available through our website. Copyright of this podcast is held by the Welsh Government.